Welcome to The Outsider Edge, where we explore fresh perspectives in economics, management, and psychology.
Great to be back.
Today marks our 13th and actually our final session digging into Dr. Ravier's general theory of coaching.
Yeah, this is it, the wrap-up.
It's really the moment where everything we've discussed before kind of comes together, the culmination of this whole intellectual journey we've been on.
Absolutely. Over our past 12 discussions here on The Outsider Edge, we've really picked apart the details of Dr. Ravier's work.
We certainly have.
So now the goal is to synthesize his overall conclusion, to give everyone the essential takeaway from his whole proposal.
Think of it like the executive summary, maybe, giving you, the listener, a clear, concise handle on the core insights from all that research.
Exactly.
We're going to focus on 4 main areas from his conclusion. First up, synthesizing the historical analysis and the systematization of the general theory.
Okay.
Second, we'll look at how he justifies achieving his original objectives.
Makes sense.
Third, how the big problems he flagged right at the start are, well, supposedly resolved by his theory.
Right, closing the loop.
And finally, we'll touch on where this might lead, the potential new avenues for research. This whole thing opens up. Ready to see how it all fits.
Let's do it. So let's start with that synthesis of the historical analysis.
Okay.
As you'll remember from our earlier sessions on The Outsider Edge, a big chunk of Ravier's thesis was this historical review, looking back at key thinkers.
Right, all those names we discussed.
But it wasn't just, a history lesson. It was specifically through the lens of what he calls the engenderment paradigm.
Engenderment paradigm, his core idea, right, about how coaching really works, in his view.
It's the one.
So, okay, why look back at all these philosophers, psychologists, through that specific lens? What was the point?
Well, the aim was to trace a kind of underlying tradition, a historical thread of thought.
Okay.
Even if the thinkers themselves weren't focused on coaching as we know it, he argues they contributed to the evolution of this engenderment paradigm.
So finding the roots, even if they didn't know they were roots at the time.
Precisely. By examining their ideas, Ravier believes he uncovered this sort of intellectual lineage leading towards his concept.
And this historical investigation, it wasn't just like an academic detour. It had a direct purpose for his theory.
Exactly. This historical analysis let Ravier pinpoint the critical aspects, the things he thought needed more theoretical heavy lifting in the second part of his thesis.
Right.
These were the areas that, if developed and organized systematically, could directly tackle the current problems in coaching and help him hit those initial objectives he set out.
And to make sense of all these historical figures, he put together a summary, right? Table 42.
Yes, exactly. Table 42 provides a non-exhaustive summary, but a summary nonetheless.
Okay.
For each key thinker, he highlights their main contributions to this developing paradigm, but also, importantly, identifies areas where their thinking maybe needed improvement or further development for a full coaching theory.
All right, let's dip into some of these. First, Platonic Socrates. What's his main contribution, according to Ravier?
The big one for Socrates is meiotics, the midwife analogy.
Helping give birth to ideas.
Right. A logical process to help someone surface new knowledge from within themselves. Crucially, through the helper acting like they don't know the answer, the non-knowing, no direct teaching.
Interesting. So it's guiding discovery, not giving answers. But Ravier saw issues with Socrates' practice, even with that principle.
Yeah. He points out that in practice, Socrates still relied on certain transfers, or what Ravier calls directivities.
Like what?
Using others' arguments, demonstrating things, making judgments, giving corrections, even using examples. So the intent might have been non-transfer methodology, but the execution still had directive elements.
Okay, that makes sense. Intent versus reality. What about Aristotle? What did he bring to the table?
Aristotle's big contribution, in Ravier's view, is his foundational theory of human action. Basically the building blocks.
The fundamentals.
Yeah, axioms, principles, categories, fundamental theorems, laws, a structure that later thinkers could build on.
So he laid the groundwork, and where did that groundwork need paving over, so to speak, for coaching?
Well, while it was foundational, Ravier felt Aristotle's theory of action needed more development to really get at the complexities relevant for coaching. And he notes that this later development really happened through praxeology, especially in economics.
Gotcha. Next up, a group. The thinkers of the philosophical reflection of existence, Kierkegaard, Jaspers, Marcel, Sartre, what did they collectively add?
This group, Ravier says, brought back focus onto fundamental aspects of being human, Things like, consciousness, freedom, responsibility, commitment, action,
This
coherence.
is big stuff.
Yeah. And the importance of subjectivity. They really highlighted the interplay between the objective world and our subjective experience. Big focus on the individual taking charge, being authentic, using their creativity, learning from experience.
Sounds very aligned with that coaching idea of the client having the answers. But again, Ravier saw room for improvement.
He did. He argues a lot of their philosophy stayed a bit, well, ambiguous, maybe less coherent, sometimes speculative.
Why was that?
Mainly, he thinks, because they didn't quite manage to correctly integrate the objective and subjective categories they were talking about, which, in his view, meant it sometimes lacked, let's say, scientific rigor.
Right. Moving on to Edmund Husserl and phenomenology. His key contribution.
Husserl brought the idea of eidetic science, something he saw as radically separate from natural sciences, based on an axiomatic logical deductive method.
Okay, eidetic science, like finding the pure essence.
Sort of, yeah. Describing core principles, theorems, laws that need systematic organization. Plus, his whole theory of phenomenology as a specific way of looking at experience needing these reductions, the epic.
A rigorous approach to principles. What was the problem with applying it?
The main thing was just the difficulty of his texts. They're dense, complex, and that led to loads of different, often conflicting interpretations, which really slowed down any kind of consistent progress in applying his method across different fields.
Then Michael Polanyi, tacit knowledge. How does that fit into coaching?
Polanyi's work on the nature, structure, dynamics of tacit knowledge is crucial for Ravier.
Tacit knowledge. The stuff we know but can't easily explain.
Exactly, like riding a bike. And Ravier points out that Polanyi's ideas actually help solve me-minus paradox.
The learning paradox. How can we learn something if we don't already know it?
Right. Polanyi's epistemology helps explain how non-transfer methodology, like meutics, can actually work. He gives it a theoretical underpinning.
Ah, okay. So Polanyi explains how Socrates' method could function. What was the limitation, though, for practical coaching?
Well, while he provided a powerful explanation, Polanyi didn't really go much further in developing practical applications of his theory in different areas. It was more philosophical.
Got it. Next, Carl Rogers. Client-centered therapy. His key contribution here.
Rogers is credited with developing an operative non-transfer methodology within a helping relationship. He really fleshed out the elements, principles, processes, competencies, attitudes for the helper.
And where did Ravier see shortcomings, especially regarding that non-transfer methodology piece?
Ravier notes Rogers kept a kind of empirical positivist scientific stance. He didn't clearly separate objective and subjective worlds, and, crucially, he eventually backed away from the term non-directivity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and Ravier argues he ended up with a theoretical practical inconsistency quite similar to Socrates, still bringing in various transfers or directions in practice.
Fascinating parallel. Okay, then Timothy Galway, the inner game. What did he add?
Galway's recognized for taking those existentialist, humanist, phenomenological ideas and making them practical, developing a new learning approach, a technique you could apply almost anywhere. Ravier sees this as the direct precursor to modern coaching.
The spark, then. But just a technique, not a full system.
Exactly. It stayed at the level of a technique, didn't become a systematized methodology. And importantly, the technique didn't fully get rid of instructions and transfers. It was still somewhat directive.
Right. And finally, the early coaching pioneers like Whitmore, Alexander, Fine, their contributions.
They basically built on Galway's inner game, added a more defined structure, grounded, Ravier argues, in non-transfer methodology.
Okay.
This let them start systematizing actual coaching processes, defining the paradigm, foundations, essence, principles, process model, conversation structure, competencies, procedures.
So they started building the house on Galway's foundation, but Ravier still saw limitations.
Absolutely. He argues their definitions of coaching were often too broad, lax, ambiguous, didn't really support a distinct methodology properly.
Which hindered development.
Yes, and led most of them, except Thompson, he notes, to largely abandon the term non-directive, which, in Ravier's view, kind of legitimized transfer, broke coaching's golden rule of staying on the coach's agenda and led to a utilitarian stance that weakened the core essence.
Wow, okay. That's a really helpful tour through the historical analysis. So from all that, Ravier pulled out 3 fundamental contributions to his engenderment paradigm.
Yes, exactly. 3 key themes kept popping up. First, the critical importance of a solid scientific foundation.
Drawing from
Aristotle's structures, recognizing objective subjective reality like the existentialists, Husserl's focus on essential principles, Polanyi integrating personal knowledge and objective reality. It's about having a robust base.
Okay, scientific foundation. What's the second fundamental contribution?
The second is this consistent recognition and, crucially, respect for the individual's personal knowledge, that inner, often unspoken knowing.
The tacit stuff again.
Yeah, but broader, too. It runs from Socrates making born, Aristotle's learning by doing, the existentialist trust in human creativity, Polanyi's tacit knowledge, Rogers seeing the client as the expert, Galway's self-too, Whitmore's hidden potential. It's all about valuing what's inside the person.
Right, trusting the coach. And the third fundamental contribution.
The third is the presence, even if imperfectly executed sometimes, of an operative methodology without transfer or directivity.
The non-transfer methodology idea.
Yes, seen in Socrates' Meutics aiming to ditch teaching, existentialist learning from experience, Rogers' initial non-directive approach, Galway minimizing instructions, Whitmore and others' golden rule about the coach's agenda.
So these three, scientific foundation, respect for personal knowledge, and non-transfer methodology, are the core historical threads Ravier identifies. And then, based on the limitations he saw, he pinpointed areas for more work.
Precisely. The shortcomings identified in the historical review directly inform the research agenda for the second part of his thesis.
Like what specifically?
Things like extending that axiomatic logical framework, better explaining the dynamics of tacit knowledge and engenderment, refining the definition of non-transfer methodology, clarifying coaching's purpose, its teleology, explicitly recognizing the underlying paradigm, offering a consistent definition describing coherent competencies, and moving beyond just techniques to a system.
So the history wasn't just backstory, it was diagnostic. It showed what needed fixing or building.
Exactly. It highlighted both the essential contributions and the key areas needing research to meet his objectives and solve those big problems he saw in coaching.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. Let's move to the second piece of his conclusion. Synthesizing the theoretical systematization itself. He organized this in 3 levels, right?
Yes. The second part of the thesis, where he builds his theory, is structured around these 3 interconnected levels of scientific foundation. Each builds on the last.
Let's break them down. Level 1, ante actio, the continent. What's the focus?
Ante actio means before action. This level is grounded in that axiomatic, logical, deductive, or eidetic science idea, finding essential principles.
The bedrock.
Exactly. Constructing the fundamental framework, the continent, everything else sits on. Key stuff here includes the axioms of human consciousness, existence, intentional action, then the categories of intentional action, causal, teleological, technological, psychological, axiological, economic, relational, organizational.
Wow, okay, quite a list.
And the core theorems of coaching purpose, motives, circumstances, expectations, engenderment, choice, renunciation, follow-up, plus the guiding principles, consciousness, freedom, trust, responsibility, commitment, coherence. It's the absolute foundation.
Establishing the fundamental truths and categories. Then level 2, post actio, the content and operative methodology. How's this different?
Post actio, after action. This shifts towards what he calls subsidiary empirical postulates. It's about articulating the nature, structure, dynamics of the individual's personal knowledge, the content.
The tacit stuff again.
Yes, and the non-transfer methodology, the actual operative method of coaching. This level has a slightly different scientific footing, needing some empirical observation.
So less purely deductive.
Right. Key components are exploring tacit knowledge in detail and the foundations of non-transfer methodology, its epistemology, how we know, teleology, purpose, methodology, how it works, and place within the paradigm. It connects the abstract principles to how coaching is actually done.
So it bridges the foundation with the practice, grounding the method in how knowledge works and the helping process unfolds. And level 3, in actio. In action. Theoretical application. What's here?
In actio, in action.
Yeah.
This is all about the practical application of the framework, addressing key issues for professional practice.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
Pretty much. This is where you find Ravier's specific definition of coaching. His pyramid of scientific coherence for practice, the situational matrix of knowledge and time, the ethical values, legal boundaries in coaching.
Okay.
Also, the foundations of the competency approach the 3 structural categories: relational, process, conversational, the 4 fundamental conversational meta-competencies.
Remind me of those 4.
Attending phenomenologically, really listening without judgment, mirroring faithfully, asking focused questions, communicating objectively.
Right.
Plus, tools oriented to the content level, the dynamics of engenderment in action, and the characteristics of self-managed coaching outcomes. This is the theory made directly applicable.
So this is where abstract theory meets the concrete reality of coaching. And Ravier really stresses the coherence of this whole three-level thing.
Absolutely. He emphasizes the whole framework is designed for deep, consistent analysis. It has built-in checks for internal coherence. Everything should logically connect across the levels.
And this coherence isn't just theoretical tidiness. It has practical implications for adding new things to coaching.
Exactly. Ravier argues any new element, a technique, a competency, a tool, has to pass muster against this framework.
How so?
It has to be consistent with level 1, the Ante, actio, axioms, and principles.
Yeah.
It must align with level 2's conclusions, especially on tacit knowledge and non-transfer methodology. And it has to fit with the components already in level 3, the practical application level.
So the general theory acts like a quality control filter for the future of coaching, ensuring things stay aligned with the core.
That's the idea. And the ultimate goal of this whole general theory is to provide a strong, unified foundation so the profession and discipline can move forward in a clear, consistent direction, progressing on a solid scientific basis.
Okay, makes sense. So we've covered the historical synthesis, the theoretical structure. Now, the third area of his conclusion, justifying that the theory actually achieves his original objectives and resolves those initial problems.
Right. This is where he connects the dots explicitly, linking the theory he built back to the goals he set and the problems he identified.
And he uses Table 44 for the objectives.
Yes. Table 44 systematically lists each main objective from the start and explains how the general theory supposedly fulfills it.
Let's take the first objective. Describing coaching's theoretical essence, its unique nature. How's that achieved?
Ravier argues it's met by establishing that distinctive definition of coaching within the in actio level, based explicitly on its epistemology, teleology, non-transfer methodology, all within the engenderment paradigm. He thinks this nails down coaching's specific way of working.
Okay. Second objective, establishing the guiding principles for practice. Justification.
He points out the guiding principles were not just listed, but crucially, they're grounded in those fundamental axioms of human consciousness, existence, and action from level 1, gives them a solid scientific footing.
Third objective, describing the core competencies coaches need. How's that addressed?
He contends he provided the foundations for a competency approach, those two main sets, the 3 structural categories and the 4 fundamental metacompetencies, defined coherently with the essence and principles, aimed at catalyzing the coach's own content.
Objective 4. Scientifically grounding the relational, process, and conversational structure. Justification.
He explains the conversation structure was scientifically grounded, offering an alternative to things like GROW based on the axioms, categories, and those 6 specific coaching theorems he developed. And the process structure was also laid out. Stages, phases, procedures, all articulated.
And the 5th, the big one, proposing a comprehensive general theory with a scientific foundation. How does he justify hitting that overarching goal?
He basically says the general theory itself, laid out in Part 2 and summarized in Table 43, is the achievement of that goal. It gives coaching that distinct identity, the elements for future development, and the means to address those long-standing criticisms and problems.
So he argues the framework itself is the justification. And this same framework provides the resolution for the fundamental problems, which he details in Table 45.
Exactly. Table 45 tackles each problem he identified back in the introduction and explains how the general theory resolves it.
Let's look at a couple. Problem 1, lack of a consensual definition. Resolution.
He admits consensus takes time, but argues his definition is so well supported by history and theory that it facilitates future consensus by clearing up current ambiguities. It provides a strong candidate.
Problem 2, coaching being linked to a messy mix of methodologies. How's that fixed?
He emphasizes the theory presents a consistent link between foundations and the specific operative method, non-transfer methodology. This detaches coaching, in his view, from that confusing methodological eclecticism.
Problem 3, borrowing tools and theories from unrelated fields without a coherent basis. The fix.
The theory provides the engenderment paradigm, the scientific, epistemological, teleological, methodological foundations as a guide, a standard to judge if other theories or tools actually fit or are compatible.
Okay. Problem 4, no recognized binding tradition to clarify its identity. resolution.
That whole historical analysis, in part, I established that evolutionary line, he argues, showing the roots of coaching's identifying essence and its radical difference from transfer-based helping.
And problem 5, scarce academic research on these fundamental issues. How does his work help?
He argues the general theory provides the necessary basis. Now researchers can review, evaluate, develop any part of it on any level. It opens the door for academic work that was basically impossible before due to lack of a shared foundation, even setting his application in scope.
So he believes the theory not only solves the problems, but unlocks future research, which leads us nicely to the final part of his conclusion, recommendations for that future research.
Yes. Given how little research there's been on these fundamentals and the scope of his own work, he sees loads of potential follow-up investigations.
And he lists quite a few, categorized by the different parts of his thesis. Let's touch on the main areas. First, analyzing authors not included in his historical review.
Yeah, a huge area. He suggests looking at figures from Socratic seminars, great books programs, Aristotelian lines through history, more existentialists, and analyzing why Heidegger wasn't included.
Interesting.
Thinkers related to Husserl's phenomenology, Polanyi's tacit knowledge, Roger's influences, people using coaching-like ideas before it was formalized, influences on Galway. Lots of historical digging still to do.
Okay. Second research area, the actio level, the foundational science. What kind of work there?
He suggests analytical studies to maybe add more axioms for solidity, logically checking his own axioms, categories, theorems for flaws, expanding the descriptions of the action categories, analyzing the guiding principles more deeply, and importantly, extending the analysis to groups and teams using his synergasia concept.
Moving to the post-actio level, the bridge to practice.
Yeah.
What empirical research is needed?
Yeah, this is about testing things out. Empirical studies on tacit knowledge itself. Empirical research on the actual effects and results of using non-transfer methodology as he defines it, and empirical work on the dynamics and results of engenderment in real coaching conversations.
Getting data on how it works in the real world. And finally, research on the in actio level, the practical application.
Loads here too. Deepening the understanding of that pyramid of scientific coherence for practice, using his knowledge time matrix to map out where this type of coaching is best suited, which topics, objectives, environments.
Right.
Also, fleshing out the competency model, furthermore detail on the structural categories and metacompetencies. Designing specific tools aligned with the theory, and analyzing how to apply the whole theory effectively in group, team, and organizational coaching.
It's definitely clear he sees his work as a starting point, not an ending. A foundation for a whole lot more exploration.
Precisely. He's laid down a comprehensive framework, opening up lines of inquiry that just weren't really possible before, he argues, because the basic building blocks weren't there or weren't agreed upon.
Well, that brings us to the end of our 13-part journey through Dr. Ravier's general theory of coaching, our final session on his work here on the outsider edge.
It's been quite the exploration.
It really has. His work, as we've seen today, definitely offers a robust framework for understanding and maybe advancing the field of coaching.
Absolutely. And hopefully for you listening, this synthesis has brought some clarity to the core ideas of this pretty extensive work, maybe sparked some aha moments or even a desire to dig into some of those research questions yourself.
And on that note, here's a final thought to chew on. Given the very clear line Dr. Ravier draws between his non-transfer methodology and more directive helping approaches, what fundamental shifts might we actually see, or perhaps should we see, in how helping professions evolve in the future?
A big question.
Something to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this final exploration of Dr. Ravier's general theory of coaching on the outsider edge.
Thanks, everyone.